Good evening, our Patriot family, and welcome to another episode of the Fight for Patriotism, where we discuss the Constitution and help us learn how it will help us fight this evil within. On tonight's episode, we will be discussing the Preamble and Article I of the Constitution. The Preamble is the very beginning of the Constitution, and Article I deals with the Congress part of government. I'm your producer, host, and brother ▴ᖿᖿᑍ, and with me is your brother Angry Conservative and your patriot sister ― I'll say a prayer, play my information, and then I'll check on how my panel is. Dear Lord, thank you for letting us come together and have another night of knowledge that we can learn together. Lord, I just want to ask you for protection for this stream so we can share this information out, since we need to fix this country. I love you, my Lord. Amen.
We need you now. We need you now. One day, one day, one day, I hope you see the truth. This puppet show stays on because of you. We've been dancing with the devil way too long. I know it's fun, but get ready to pay your dues. Oh God, come back home. This crazy world is filled with liars and abusers. We need you now before we're too far gone. I hope one day they finally see the truth. God, we need you now.
How are you doing today, Angry Conservative and ―
Ladies first.
Oh, I'm doing great. How about you, Zach? I'm sorry.
I'm doing good too, and I always let ladies go first. That's how I am. And Zach, we do need to know how you doing, my friend.
I'm doing good. I was busy today actually with work.
That's always a good thing. Zach, I got a question for you. How short is what's more important, do you think, the preamble to the Constitution or all the articles? And ― same question to you, young lady.
I'll have to Google about half of that before I can answer you. I know about the Federalist Papers and I know about the Constitution. Everything else sounded like a different language.
Because the Constitution is broke up into the preamble, Article I, which deals with Congress. Article II deals with the president and vice president and all those people. Article 3 is the judicial system. As you can tell, I know a lot about the Constitution. And Zach?
The preamble because it gives us the powers.
And yes, it does. And that's what people don't realize. It gives us a lot of powers.
I'll tell you, your stream yesterday was really good, Zach.
And good evening to everyone down in chat, because I know I will be So should I tell them about the actual video, Zach, or are you going to do it? All right. The first video Zach is going to show is from the Khan Academy. It is going to talk about, it's about 15 minutes long. It's going to talk about the preamble. Yes, the preamble is that important, even though it is a very short and very precise writing for the beginning of the Constitution, because most of us know the first few words of the preamble, but most people do not know what comes after it.
By the way, I'm sorry chat, most of you don't have wrenches because this is my backup, so I wrenched the main people so far. My main channel has a strike until next Thursday.
Badge of honor, Zach.
It is a badge of honor. I think we've all been there, bud. I just had, hey Zach, you want to hear something funny? The night you get your strike is the night that mine got taken off after 90 days. So they had to get one of us. Hey, Zach, we got a teacher in the room. Down in the chat, Southern Belle teacher says, yes, it is very important, yet my students don't care to learn it. That says something. That is.
I definitely went deep last night and I loved it.
I've been always heard about that the nanoparticles and the Q-tips and the test swabs, but even I'm like, is that too far? Am I a conspiracy theorist? Am I going too far? But then ones you showed I hadn't seen, but I had seen others, and that's the part for me is that I kept noticing early on whenever it was like, get this, get it, get it, get it, get it. It was, well, but if you don't get it, then you have to get tested all the time, and then we'll forgive it. But you have to get tested or you have to get it. So it's kind of like you're doing one or the other, and that's kind of where my red flag went up right there. And then the video stuff that was in it, that makes a lot of sense because they're going to get you one way or the other. Pick your poison. I've never been tested still, thank God.
And Backyard Chicken Man, you're right. It is something that's not taught in schools anymore. I can remember, because of my age, I can remember learning all of this stuff. I can remember I can remember in government class, my senior year of high school, I had to recite from memory the actual preamble of the Constitution. I don't remember it anymore, but I remember most of it, but I do not remember all of it.
So the first video I'm going to play is for the preamble.
Hello, everyone. This is Sal here, and I'm here with Jeffrey Rosen, who's head of the National Constitution Center. What are we going to talk about today, Jeff?
We're going to talk about the preamble to the U.S. Constitution.
That sounds very important.
It is very important. The entire theory of popular sovereignty is contained within these beautiful words, so we've got a lot to talk about.
And before we even get into it, what do you mean by the theory of popular sovereignty?
So the preamble begins with the famous words, "We the people of the United States," and those signal that in the United States, power belongs to we the people. It doesn't belong to our representatives in Congress. It doesn't even belong to the state governments. And that was a huge shift because an original draft of the preamble read, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut," and so forth. But James Wilson, who was the main drafter of the preamble, changed those words. And at some point, the preamble was changed to the famous words we know now, "We the people of the United States." That meant that when some southern states tried to secede from the Union before the Civil War, arguing that they were sovereign as state governments, President Lincoln resisted their constitutional ability to secede, saying that since we the people of the United States had created the Constitution, the majority of we the people of the United States would have to agree before any state could leave it. So that's why it was a huge shift in the conception of power that James Wilson embodied in these words. Before the preamble, people believed that legislatures were sovereign. In Britain, the king in parliament was sovereign. But in America, thanks to Wilson and his brilliant colleagues, we the people of the United States as a whole became sovereign, and that came to chart the entire constitutional history. But then we have all of these purposes for which the Constitution was formed. And to form a more perfect union, establish justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And then we're saying that that's the reason that we established the Constitution. There's lots to unpack there, but maybe we should focus on those final words, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The framers believe that our rights come not from government, but from God or nature, that we're born with them. And when we move from the state of nature into civil society to form a government, we surrender temporary control over certain of those rights in order to secure the safety and security of the rights we've retained. So that means that certain rights are unalienable, to use Jefferson's language in the Declaration. We can't alienate them to government when we form government. And the purpose of alienating temporary control over certain rights, like allowing the government to punish murder rather than, having private violence, is to secure the blessings of liberty of retained natural rights, the first of which the framers believed was complete freedom of conscience, the right to believe or not to believe according to the dictates of our conscience. So we really see that idea of securing the blessings of liberty is implicit in the idea that our rights come from God and not government, that government only has temporary control of them, and reinforces once again that we should never confuse the actions of the government, laws that Congress or the state governments pass, with the will of the people. We, the people, are sovereign. The government is our servants. We are the principals. And when there's a clash between the will of the principals represented by the Constitution and the will of the servants represented by the legislatures, we prefer the principal to the agent. That was what Hamilton said in Federalist 78 in justifying the Supreme Court's power to strike down unconstitutional laws, that because the Constitution, ratified in the name of we the people, represents our views more profoundly than those of ordinary laws. That's why judges have to prefer the Constitution to ordinary laws. So once again, we're seeing packed into this preamble so much natural law theory and theory of popular sovereignty. There's one other really important notion contained in those words, securing the blessings of liberty in the name of we the people, and that's that the Constitution itself didn't get to speak for we the people when it was proposed. It wasn't until it was ratified by special conventions that had been elected for that purpose that it earned the right to speak in the name of we the people as a whole. James Wilson was very keen on the idea that it was the ratifying conventions, not the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, that gave the document its status as supreme law. And that idea that only laws that go through a special procedure specified in the Constitution in Article V, which is the amendment procedure, or by special constitutional conventions, get to speak in the name of we the people, is absolutely core to the whole theory of American constitutionalism.
Why were the founding fathers so focused on this notion of popular sovereignty, of elected officials being servant to the people, and making it so strongly embedded even here in the preamble?
They just fought a revolution based on the idea that the tyrannical King George had infringed the natural rights of the people, had refused to grant basic powers of representation, and had broken the social contract, and therefore had lost the right to govern people because he was governing without consent. One of the natural rights that people believed were unalienable and retained by the people was the right to alter and abolish government whenever it threatens the retained natural rights of the people. That's in the Declaration of Independence, and in the Constitution it can be found in Article V. So that right of revolution was part and parcel of the idea that our basic natural rights are retained. And you have to remember how revolutionary it was to be talking of popular sovereignty in 1787. There were almost no democratic self-governments on earth then. There had been small-scale democracies in Greece and Rome, in Athens, Solon, or in Sparta, Lycurgus had been lawgivers, but no people had ever, as the scholar Akilah Mar says, voted on a written constitution before, deliberated it, and had it ratified in their name. So that's what was so radical about that. Even the handful of the sort of partial democracies at the time, like the limited suffrage in the British Parliament or the Swiss cantons, hadn't had a written constitution that was ratified by popular deliberation. So that's what made it radical, and that was Wilson's distinct contribution to America's entire theory of democratic self-government. And that's why if you had to talk about the essence of constitutionalism today, it's not populism. It's not a quick, direct vote. It's not Brexit. It's not a referendum. It's long periods of deliberation so that the text earns the right to speak in the name of we the people. And it was the very reason for which the revolutionaries fought the American Revolution.
Fascinating. And let's continue. So we said we have "we the people of the United States." It establishes the popular sovereignty. And then it says "in order to," and it lists a bunch of reasons why we are, what we're trying to do. And we already did secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What are the other things we want to talk about?
Let's go back in order. And the next, the first purpose is in order to form a more perfect union. Well, that was the central goal of the Constitutional Convention. The previous union, represented by the Articles of Confederation, had been imperfect. That was sovereign states that were unable to achieve common purposes. They couldn't raise money to support forces in war. They couldn't put down rebellions by debtors in Massachusetts, known as Shays' Rebellion. They needed a unanimous vote to achieve anything, and essentially the government didn't work. So the framers came to Philadelphia in order to form a more perfect union by establishing a constitution strong enough to achieve common purposes, but restrained enough to retain natural rights. And that's what a perfect union is. It's not a consolidated government because the states retained powers under the 10th Amendment. All powers not vested in the United States as a whole are retained by the states or the people. And ultimately, it's we the people who retain the ultimate power because we're the ones who are sovereign, but we can parcel that power out either to state governments or to the federal government in order to ensure the protections of liberty. So that's what a more perfect union is, and that's why it was so appropriate that Lincoln, in defending the Union during the Civil War, resisted the authority of the state governments to secede on the grounds that we, the people of the United States, needed to consent before the Union could become less perfect.
I just want to double click on that a little bit because the words "more" and "perfect" normally go together. You're either perfect or you're not. And so part of the narrative that I think I'm hearing is that we had the Articles of Confederation, which were imperfect, and we want to get closer to being perfect. And so that's one of the reasons here. Many times when I look at to form a more perfect union, it also, at least to me, kind of invokes this notion of continuously trying to get better even from the starting point.
So you're right to parse it closely. We're trying continuously to get better, but perfection doesn't mean amalgamation. In other words, the most perfect union wouldn't be a total union in which all power is united in the federal government, for example, and not parceled out between the federal government and the states, and also not separated out so the various branches can check each other. We want a union perfect enough to achieve common purposes, but not so strong as to threaten liberty. And it was that delicate balance that was crucial to Madison's vision, and that led to most of the tensions in the Constitutional Convention.
Yep. And then establish justice.
Well, my goodness, there's a lot packed into that. And you might think that that mandate to establish justice gives judges the power to do justice, regardless of, let the heavens fall, to use the expression. But that's not what the Supreme Court has held. In a really interesting case, the Supreme Court, it was called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It came down in 1905. The Supreme Court rejected the claim that the preamble to the Constitution conferred independent powers that could be enforced by judges. In other words, it wasn't a general mandate that allowed judges to do justice regardless. Instead, Justice Harlan said in the Jacobson case, although the preamble indicates the general purposes for which the people ordained and established the Constitution, it has never been regarded as the source of any substantive power conferred on the government of the United States or any of its departments. Such powers embrace only those expressly granted in the body of the Constitution, or, and this is the final bit, and such as may be implied from those so granted. So established justice is a broad declaration of purposes. Many parts of the Constitution help the government to establish justice, including the Bill of Rights, which requires that people can't be deprived of liberty without due process of law. If they're going to have a criminal trial, they have all sorts of rights to confront witnesses, to be tried by jury, and so forth. But it's those specific articulation of the rights that allow us to establish justice that are the ones that judges can enforce. The goal, the broad goal, is the one set out in the preamble.
And then we have ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare.
Yeah, so domestic tranquility is of central concern to the framers. They're concerned about armed mobs like those I mentioned in Massachusetts and Shays' Rebellion, where debtors and farmers in Western Massachusetts are rebelling against their creditors. So they want to allow the government enough power to put down these insurrections, but they don't want a government so strong that it'll create standing armies that can be permanent threats to liberty of the kind that King George's army was. So that's why the Second Amendment to the Constitution wants to provide for well-regulated militias that can help ensure domestic tranquility, but doesn't want to empower a permanent standing army, because it believes that ultimately the people do have to retain the ability to take up arms to defend their own liberty if the government is threatening it as part of their unalienable right to alter and abolish government. So that's the domestic tranquility part. And then the common defense, of course, is hugely important, and Congress has the power to declare war. The president is commander-in-chief. The president has the power to repel sudden attacks, but otherwise it's supposed to be Congress, in theory at least, that authorizes the deployment of troops abroad, and the parts of Article I for Congress and Article II for the president that give those two branches war-making powers help to ensure that the Constitution provides for the common defense. The final clause I hesitated to introduce because it's so incredibly broad: promote the general welfare. Wow. Well, I mean, that could be read as a kind of blank check for the government to do whatever it thinks is necessary to promote the general welfare. But both the Supreme Court and also the framers in ratifying the Constitution made clear that the general welfare clause was not a blank check. It was Congress and the president could only exercise the powers that were either explicitly granted by the Constitution or could be fairly implied by them. And yet at the same time, Chief Justice John Marshall and others suggested that those powers have to be broadly construed enough to achieve the purposes of the Constitution, which include promoting the general welfare. So you might say that promoting the general welfare is a different expression of the goal of promoting a more perfect union, except you could say that there's a separate goal of passing laws that are in the general welfare, again, without threatening liberty. And that clause, once again, embodies this tectonic balance between empowering government, but also protecting retained rights.
So just to make sure that we got all of the big points, we've learned that although the preamble itself isn't a basis for justice like the body of the Constitution, it establishes that we, the people, are the source of political power in the United States. It explains that the Constitution would form a more perfect union between the states and the federal government than the weak Articles of Confederation, while ensuring that the people still retain their natural rights. To learn more about the preamble, which I encourage you to do, visit the National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution and Khan Academy's resources on U.S. government and politics.
Hey, this is Kim from Khan.
One of my favorite videos to actually watch. And Thunder. Actually, there are not too many loopholes in the Constitution, because it does, if you go throughout, if you look at each branch with each article of the Constitution, it tells you who's actually in charge. But yeah, this is one of my, because a lot of it can be construed because we don't talk like they did in the 1700s today. We have a different language than what they were. Hey, Mayor. But it is interesting how that Constitution has stood up for almost 250 years.
So what are your thoughts on the preamble?
It tells us what the Constitution's there for. It breaks it down.
I'm gonna jump down, Zach, but I'll be listening. This is above my head. It's above my pay grade. I can't contribute much. But thanks for having me up, and I'll be listening and I'll be learning. See you later. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Cola. But But yeah, the preamble lays it out how we're actually how the Constitution's actually formed. But what do you think of the preamble, Zach? Because but with that preamble, there is a lot of parts to it. There is a lot of things that it says, and it doesn't have a whole lot of words. And you all right, Zach? All right.
I know it basically means that it gives us the power to be citizens.
Yeah. It also gives us power to be in control of the government. As we're on a step forward, it tells us in the very next article, the very first article of the Constitution, how Congress, if you want to start pulling that up, how Congress is actually supposed to be delivered. I honestly think we need to go back to that.
Me, and today I'm learning about Article 1 of the US Constitution. Article 1 is jam-packed with information about how our government is supposed to work. But principally what it does is create the legislative branch of government, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate, which together comprise the Congress of the United States. Article 1 also tells us how people can get elected to those bodies and what powers Congress has. To learn more about Article 1, I talked to two constitutional experts. ᖏᖼᘍ፰ is a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, whose research focuses on constitutional law, property law, and the study of popular political participation. Professor Heather Gerken is the dean of Yale Law School. She's a leading expert on constitutional law and election law, and her research focuses on federalism, diversity, and dissent.
Article 1 gives an enormous amount of power to the legislative branch, otherwise known as Congress, and it was designed specifically to overcome some of the problems that they'd seen under the Articles of Confederation.
The legislative power under the Articles of Confederation was pretty weak, in part because the Congress under the Confederate Articles didn't have the authority to directly tax the states. They also lacked a lot of other powers that were eventually given to Congress under the Constitution.
These were the things that really mattered. If you're building a young nation, you need to be able to do certain things in order to protect it, especially at that time when there were many, many other countries that were circling around wanting to grab land and power. And so the United States needed to defend itself in those early days.
Okay, so we all know today that our legislative branch is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, but it didn't have to be that way. So why was it that the framers settled on this two-house structure? for the legislative branch?
I think for several reasons. One is that it was a compromise between the small states and the large states. The large states, the ones that have a lot of population, wanted representation in Congress in accordance with population. Obviously, then the large states would get more representatives. The small states, on the other hand, were concerned that they would be dominated by the large states if that happened. So in the end, the compromise is you have one house, the House of Representatives, which is largely apportioned based on population, and one house, the Senate, which is apportioned based on each state having 2 votes, no matter how small or how large it is. A second reason why you end up with the structure is the influence of the British example. The British had both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, of course, being more subject to popular pressure, while the House of Lords was this elite aristocracy. And the founders also wanted a combination of popular and elite power. And it was thought that the Senate would fill that elite role, in part because initially the senators were chosen by state legislatures rather than by the voters directly.
So the House of Representatives, which is based on districts, is supposed to represent you based on where you live. And the Senate, which is based on states, is supposed to allow, at that time, the state legislature to nominate 2 luminaries from the state to represent the state.
So yeah, for a long time, the senators were actually appointed. Now they're elected.
Senators were appointed until the passage of the 17th Amendment, which amended Article I, and that gave state legislatures a fair amount of influence over who went to the national government.
But it is also true that many states by that time already effectively had popular election of senators.
Really interesting. Okay, so you described the Senate as being kind of the American version of the House of Lords, a little bit more elite, a little less subject to popular opinion. How does that carry over into the Senate that we have today? How are its powers different from the House of Representatives?
It does have certainly different powers from the House in some respects. For example, it has the power to ratify treaties and to confirm appointments to the court and to the president's cabinet. So earlier this year, when Neil Gorsuch was appointed to the Supreme Court, he had to be confirmed by the Senate. Obviously, today, senators are elected just like members of the House are. And I think they're every bit as partisan and almost as sensitive to public opinion as members of the House of Representatives. So the difference between the Senate and the House in that regard, maybe it hasn't completely disappeared, but it's certainly greatly diminished.
Okay, so there are certain powers that are reserved to the Senate. Are there particular powers that are reserved to the House of Representatives?
The House is important. Don't underestimate the importance of the House. I'll just say the House of Representatives, for example, is allowed to initiate impeachment proceedings against the president.
If the House votes in favor of impeachment, then the Senate holds a trial to determine whether the official in question gets convicted or not.
As a general matter, though, they're roughly co-equal. For the big, important things like passing legislation, you need both of them to work together.
So together, these two houses make up Congress. So how is Congress different from the executive branch or the judicial branch? What are its powers?
The way that the framers understood it was that each one would have their own job. So the judiciary, obviously, was there to judge disputes between people, to run the court system, etc. The executive was there to carry out the laws. And so the executive's job is to administer the law once it has been made. And of course, the legislature is there to legislate. So its main job was to make the law. And at the time, I will just tell you, everyone thought that the big gorilla in the room was Congress, that it would be by far the most powerful organization. The framers simply did not anticipate how powerful both the judiciary and the president would become over time.
So what happens if, for example, the Congress and the president don't get along?
Well, it happens quite a lot. The president could refuse to accept laws passed by Congress. He can veto them. In that event, Congress could only override it.
Virginia, you said it quite plainly and very eloquently, because the issue that we have today is the Constitution is being reinterpreted right now. Because with everything going on, the Constitution, if you would sit down and actually read it, it tells you everything you need to know. It tells you who makes the laws. Like we're doing right now, Congress makes the laws. Who enforces those laws? The president and the DOJ and the FBI and all of those people. We need to go back to when this Constitution was written, back to the 1700s. Actually, the 1780s, to be exact. Because the Constitution, words today mean something different. Because I can give you an example. Back in the 1700s, a well-regulated militia, I'm going to use the Second Amendment here for a moment, Zach. A well-regulated militia to be necessary for a free state, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. What a well-regulated militia in the 1700s, the late 1700s and early 1800s, mean they were well trained. When we think of a well-regulated militia, we think they're fit for battle. No, they were well trained. They knew their weapons. And sir and I agree, F the mob rule. I agree with that statement.
Exactly, and we have another issue as well, because we have people in government that are using our money to fulfill their careers, and that's not how our founding fathers set it up as.
Very astute, Zach. Very astute. Because when I bring up that Congress should not be paid other than for their travel to go to D.C., I have had people come and say, why shouldn't they get paid? The founding fathers did not get paid. All they got was a stipend for their travel to wherever they had to go, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, wherever it was. Why should the members of Congress be any different than the people that, like me and you? Them members actually had to pay taxes. I think that would solve a lot of our problems right there. But that's just coming from a redneck that grew up in Ohio that lives in Alabama. That's all I'm saying. Hey, Mrs. Ghetto.
Two-thirds of both the House and the Senate voted to do so. Congress, on the other hand, can pressure the president in various ways. They can hold hearings investigating his conduct of various issues. They can defund agencies of the executive branch whose job performance they don't like. They can refuse to confirm the president's appointees to various offices, and in extreme cases that have happened couple of times in our history, Congress can even impeach the president, and if he gets convicted in the Senate, then he would be removed from office. This is what led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. The House of Representatives impeached him, and Nixon resigned before he could be tried in the Senate. President Andrew Johnson and President Bill Clinton were also both impeached. And in both cases, the Senate ultimately acquitted them, but it was still a very painful time for both of those presidents.
So speaking of antagonistic relationships, I think one thing that's really come to dominate Congress is partisanship. To what extent did the Constitution anticipate this rise of parties and partisanship?
They actually knew about parties to some degree from the British experience, but they were very suspicious of them, and they hoped and perhaps expected that they wouldn't emerge in America to anything like the same extent that they had in Britain. But in actual fact, within a few years after the adoption of the Constitution, we already had the first party system, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and partisan alignments have played a big role in Congress ever since then.
So even back then, there were rival interpretations of how the Constitution should be carried out and what kind of power the national government should wield. But they somehow thought, naively, I think, that the parties would disappear and that people would have allegiances to their state or to their region, but they wouldn't be have allegiance to a party. That broke down completely, almost immediately after the Constitution was written. That leads to a real problem these days, because most modern constitutions recognize that there will be two parties, that they will be in competition with one another, and that part of the job of the Constitution is to regulate that competition.
Would the founders have done anything differently? If they had known about parties and expected that they would play such a big role, it's hard to know for sure, but maybe they would have been less confident than some of them were that Congress would always stand up for its prerogatives against the president. When the president and Congress are of the same party, I think often Congress is inclined to overlook various presidential abuses.
If the reverse is true, things might be very difficult to do.
Exactly. I mean, the whole point about them needing to act, needing one another to act is really a problem if one side is antagonistic to the other side.
One other thing we see here in Article I is talking about kind of what the federal government does versus what the states do. So this is kind of the idea of federalism then. Could you tell us a little bit more just about what federalism is and how it's supposed to work?
So the way that we understand federalism back then was that there was a division of labor. The states would regulate things that were inside their territories and accorded to them in terms of responsibility. And the federal government would regulate everything that was accorded to it under the Constitution. The problem is, as Congress's power became more and more expansive, it ended up regulating the same areas that the states regulate.
So if the federal government and the states have a law on the same topic, who wins?
As long as it's passed properly by the federal government wins. So if there's a federal law and the state law is inconsistent with it, the state law is displaced.
Is there anything that might surprise the framers about how our Congress operates today?
When the framers created Article I and drafted it, they certainly expected that Congress would have more power under the Constitution than it did under the Articles of Confederation. But I don't think very many of them would have believed that Congress would ever be able to do things like forbid the growth of medical marijuana in your backyard, or regulate what kind of toilet you're allowed to have in your house, or for that matter, do something like the war on drugs, which forbids the possession of drugs throughout the country and the like. Originally, the power to regulate interstate commerce, which is the authority under which most of these things are done, it was at the time conceived of as a power for Congress to break down trade barriers between states and perhaps regulate the actual shipment or trade in goods and services across state lines. It was not until the 20th century, particularly after the New Deal, that Congress was able to start using this as a power to regulate nearly every aspect of human life that might, in some respect, affect the national economy. So that, I think, is a huge change.
I think what would really surprise the framers is how willing Congress has been to give up its own power. So Congress has given the president a lot of power because it's created administrative agencies.
Stop it right there, Zach.
that therefore allow the president to use his entire administrative agency apparatus to pursue his goals.
So we've learned.
I am going to say this. I know where she's coming from, but I'm going to say this. That's a load of crap. The federal Congress, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Senate have not diminished their power. They've added more power to them that they get, and they gave some to the president with the executive orders. But, and yes, I knew that was coming. I should have warned you before it actually happened to stop it right there when she was talking about that. But that gets me every freaking time. But do you agree with my statement, Zach, that that's a load of bullcrap? I'm trying to be nice. I don't want to put something on this channel. So I'm trying to watch what I say. Dang. But yeah, that's a load of bullcrap. Let's finish the video. I know we don't have much time left.
That Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch of U.S. government, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. These two bodies were created to balance popular power with elite power, since members of the House of Representatives were directly elected by the people, whereas senators were appointed by state legislatures. Although one major change is that senators are now elected as well, what might really surprise the framers about Congress today is how its power has evolved over time. On one hand, as ‏ mentioned, the powers of the president and the Supreme Court have grown compared to the powers of Congress. But on the other hand, as ᴏ᷅᷅ points out, the framers might be surprised at just how much of our lives Congress can regulate today. To learn more about Article 1, visit the National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution and Khan Academy's resources on U.S. government.
And Zach, put Yankees comment up. It is. I think Congress sidestepped the 10th Amendment. Yep. And we'll get into that a little down the line, but yeah, the U.S. Congress has sidestepped the 10th Amendment. I will admit to that one, yes. Zach, I'm going to say this now. The people that are watching this are very smart individuals. They are very smart individuals because they do know their Constitution. And I'm going to say this now. Hey, David, please share this with your friends and family so they get a better understanding of the Constitution, because I know Zach's put a lot of time into this. I put a lot of time into doing the research and rereading what it actually says. Fuck, dude. But yeah. Zach, I'm gonna ask you this. Do you think Congress, the federal Congress, not the state Congresses, but the federal Congresses have overstepped their bounds? Thunder, that's very true. And I'm trying I want this information out there so people can learn about the Constitution, to know the Constitution. Because that's why I love that Zach asked me to join him on this. Zach,
Yes, because best example is Pelosi.
yeah. Because I'm not going to say no names, but she made a statement when 45 was in office that no one's above the law. Well, it looks like she's pulled a miracle out her yin yang. So, but that's a whole other topic for another day, Zach. Am I right about that one? But yeah,
We need term limits.
sorry about that, my friend. And I want to address Thunder's comment about term limits, if you don't mind, Zach. Thunder, we are actually, the way the Constitution is written, we the people are actually are supposed to be the term limits if we don't like somebody. We are actually supposed to be. That's what we're here for, is to put them term limits on politicians. But a lot of people do not want to actually do that because they are scared that they're going to be Epsteined. Yeah, I'll call it Epsteined. Because that is just a bunch of bull crap. But if we're supposed to be the term limit, we need to actually do that for ourselves. If you don't like, tell people around you to vote them out.
Well, hey family, thank you for coming tonight and learning about the beginning of the Constitution. We need to learn this because knowledge will always defeat evil. Any last words, Angry?
I don't know if we're gonna do 2 and 3 next week, or if we're just gonna do not Article 2. But people, go to my website and download the Constitution for yourself and actually read it. Actually learn it, because there's a lot of information in that little 19-page download. But Zach, thank you for letting me come up and helping you.
I love you all so much. The Bible verse for Thursday, June 9th, 2022 is, "All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work." 2 Timothy 3:16-17 NIV.
We need you now. We need you now. One day, one day, one day. Oh, one day, I hope you see the truth. This puppet show stays on because of you. We've been dancing with the devil way too long. I know it's fun, but get ready to pay your dues. Oh God, come back home. This crazy world is filled with liars and abusers. We need you now before we're too far gone.
Good night, everybody.
Now go to ghettos to see us whoop his butt.